As many of you know, Kathy also directs our master's program in risk and prevention. She also holds an appointment at the Harvard Medical School and is a senior staff at the Law and Psychiatry Service at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she serves as a forensic mental health expert for children and adults involved with the legal system. I don't know how she does it all. Please join me in welcoming Kathy Ayub.
Thank you, Kathy. And I'm very pleased you talked about the school's response to Katrina. And I'm very pleased to be here to be able to talk about Katrina and work with families and children. Before I do that, I want to say just a little bit about my distinguished panelists. First of all, Jesse Howes, who I'm very proud to say is a graduate of the Risk and Prevention Program. I met Jesse through the Risk and Prevention Program, and he not only was dedicated to practice and has a good deal of experience working in early childhood programs and Head Start, but then became quite interested in trauma and now is an outreach clinician at the Children's Recovery Foundation. Jesse has spent his last assignment working at Otis Air Force Base with the survivors of Hurricane Katrina, and there are several of the wonderful families that he worked with that are here with us tonight as well. And I know that a number of you have personal contacts with Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and these parts of the world. So for all of you who have special connections to Katrina, I want to say thank you for being here. And I want you to know Jesse because he has really very selflessly given a great deal of his time over the last several months to be with families who really have lost everything, and now I think have the beginning of some wonderful gifts. So Jesse, thank you for being here. And then my colleague, Dr. William Beardsley. Bill is a wonderful colleague and mentor. He has had multiple leadership roles at Children's Hospital and Judge Baker Children's Center, where I met Bill as a doctoral intern. Bill has done international work on depression and adversity, and some of you who know him know that he really has an extraordinary way of working with families in adversity to really help them think about how important it is to be a parent in a very positive and preventive way. Dr. Beardsley, as our dean has mentioned, is a Gardner Monk Professor of Child Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, and he has been incredibly dedicated to work at Boston Children's Hospital, where he has chaired the Department of Psychiatry for a number of years. So again, welcome to you both. It's really an honor for me to be part of this panel with each of you. I'm going to start by just briefly reviewing what I remember about Katrina. Hurricane Katrina was the 11th named tropical storm of the season, the third major hurricane and the first Category 5 hurricane in the 2005 Atlantic hurricane season. It's the sixth strongest storm ever recorded in the Atlantic basin. And I was actually surprised that it was not first. Actually, Wilma, which also was a 2005 hurricane, was actually somewhat stronger. However, Hurricane Katrina does hold the record for being the most devastating hurricane that we have probably experienced in the history of the United States. It began on August 23rd and really died out on August 31st, 2005. And the first landfall, which hit Florida, was really quite difficult, but it was the second landfall on August 29th, 2005 that really created this significant disaster. Again, as Dean McCartney mentioned, Louisiana, Mississippi, the Florida Panhandle, and Alabama were massively hit by this natural disaster. The highest winds were 175 miles an hour sustained, and there were a number of people who found themselves lost in high winds and in water. The rescue efforts came locally, state, and national, and we're not here to talk specifically about those except in the context of what they meant for the individuals who were involved. But as you can see by this brief series of photographs, the devastation was extraordinary, and the beautiful city of New Orleans was affected because of the failure of the levees and the extensive flooding that took place in that beautiful city. The damage of the storm is estimated to be over $130 billion, and I understand that that number is going up, and that's only acute damage, so that the long-term effects have really not yet been calculated. We know that a conservative fatality figure is 1,325 people, and this probably is higher. And we know that from this storm, there are 1 million people who remain displaced. That includes between 400,000 and 500,000 children. And I know that both Jesse and Bill will talk about the tremendous impact and what it means to lose everything. Your home, your neighborhood, your family, your pets, and to not be able to go back and regain any of that for a number of people. I understand from the most recent report in the news that approximately half, and this is probably conservatively promising, that probably only half of the residents of New Orleans will return or be able to return to that city. As you know, trying to both acutely and in the long term provide the help that is so acutely asked for here was really and continues to be difficult. And again, the faces of anguish we've seen in the media. These photos, by the way, are from ABC News and the BBC, and a number of you probably have seen them more than once over the last several months. To give you a few more facts and figures, 90,000 miles of country were designated as a federal disaster area. By the 1st of September, there were 60,000 people in the New Orleans Superdome. It was supposed to hold up to 15,000 to 25,000. And there was not supposed to be anyone in the New Orleans Convention Center, and there were 20,000 people there by the 1st of September. We now know that the state which now houses the largest number of survivors, as a number of people from the area have told me they'd like to be called, is Texas, and there are approximately between 230 and 250,000 people in Texas. The majority of them were there by the 5th of September. This, by the way, is a Superdome immediately after the hurricane. But there have been a number of other families who are now residing in up to 10 or 11 states across the United States. And we're going to talk not only about those children and families that are in Louisiana, Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, but also in Massachusetts, in West Virginia, in a number of other states, and what this must mean for them, families and children, to have had this experience and what it will continue to mean for them. In thinking about these children, I'd like to say a few words about what we know about childhood trauma and how we might apply some of that information to try to be helpful. First of all, our bodies and minds are so marvelously adaptive to adversity. We really respond in an incredibly powerful way and adapt when we're in life-threatening situations, which many of these families experienced. We really bring intensive coping mechanisms mechanisms into play, and we do it quite instinctively, biologically. As a number of you know, we are really wonderfully put together. But we then really wait and hope that the crisis is over so that we can let down, we can gain control, and we can master that incredibly difficult experience that we had. In this case, the mastery is going on because the loss continues. And so we probably have a situation of not only an acute and complete experience of loss and disaster, but we have people who really cannot now go back and rebuild in many situations. They need to think about how to adjust to a new environment, to a new place, to people they don't know, to neighborhoods they have never experienced. And so what is that like in the long run? It takes those acute mechanisms that we all use to cope when we either fight like hell or we run like hell. And my guess is that that was the instinct that saved a number of people in this disaster. But we can't keep doing that without a lot of issues that really can hurt us in the long run in terms of coping. We know that it taxes our bodies. We know that it taxes our souls. So to think about that in the context of not only this moment and an acute disaster, but what it means for people who have experienced this kind of natural disaster and displacement in the long run is some of what we're going to be talking about. There are two critical things that often happen to people as they continue to experience really difficult events. One is we move from seeing the world as a positive place to seeing the world as a negative place. We feel that other people are going to threaten us, that they might hurt us. You know, what happens when it rains again? What happens when there's another nor'easter if these are people living in this part of the world? What does that do for us? What does that mean? Does it mean that we have to continue to be frightened? So, and do we move to thinking about things in that kind of a threatening way rather than to think, oh, it's raining, wonderful. You know, the grass will get greener, the flowers may grow. It's a really radical change in thinking. The other thing that we find that we do if we experience extended trauma is that we tend to not be able to hold it all together within ourselves. So we almost in some ways hold pieces of really difficult experiences, and we either hold them separate and we really want to avoid any talk about them, or we just can't stop talking. So we may have one extreme or the other. We can't focus on anything else, or we may not be able to focus on the trauma. But to put it into perspective is really hard. I'd ask you to think about these two things as I ask our next two panelists to come up and talk and continue to tell us. First, Jesse Howes is going to tell us about the work that he's done with families and what that experience was like. And then Bill Beardsley is going to talk about talking to children about difficult issues and how important it is to work with children and families, both who have directly experienced this disaster, but also children and families who have watched it on television, thought about it, and care about it, like those of you sitting in the audience. So without further ado, Jesse.
So, thank you very much, guys. Welcome. It's good to be here. I'd just like to say it's really humbling to be sitting up here right now with Kathy and Bill. If this were the Jackson family, I feel like I'd be Tito, sitting next to Michael and Janet. But you know what I mean? Nothing about their personal lives, just how successful they were. And I promise there'll be no wardrobe malfunctions of any sort. So for that, I just wanted to say thank you to both Kathy and Bill, and also Kathy McCartney and Megan and Sean and the graduate school for putting this all together. Because it's really an honor and a blessing to be able to work with people and share the work that we've done, especially when people have been through experiences where there's just been some really intense fear and often a really gross violation of trust. To be able to enter into a relationship with folks when that's happened is really amazing and meaningful. So it's just nice to be able to be here and talk about it with you guys and share some of the work that I've done. Before we do that, I want to see if you guys will join me in a little exercise. It'll take about 1 minute. And please don't do it if you feel uncomfortable doing it. But basically all I need you to do is just try and put your hand right here on your face. And right with your nose almost touching your palm. If you have bad breath, you might not want to do this. So how's your vision right now, guys? It's not very good. I mean, how many fingers am I holding up? All right, if you say 2, you're cheating. All right, so you can't really see much, and everything you do see is really through this veil of your hand. So now if you just try and move your hand about 3 inches to the right or left of your face. And you can see a little bit better. I mean, now you can see I have 2 or 3 fingers, 4 or 5. You can get this. But you can still see your hand right there, and if someone was going to throw a baseball and, you might not be able to catch it. And now for the last, let's just move our hand almost over here, all the way to almost out of our vision. We can see it on the periphery. So it's still there. We know it's there, but we can see things pretty well. We could probably go play a game of basketball or write a paper or do something like this. Now, I want you to think of your hand in this sense as a trauma, as a traumatic event. Right when it happens, this is how it is. This is how it influences the way we see the world and the way we interact with people. And slowly, as we heal, or as individuals heal, it moves away, but it's always there. So I think I learned a lot about this from Kathy working on the Developmental Pathways Project, where something happens or a series of events happen, and it doesn't just change the individual at that point. The individual then has to develop a set of coping mechanisms which may impact how they live their life throughout. And it's pretty much what we're working with there. And how this trauma is really different than other traumas is that the aggressor in this situation, the perpetrator in the situation, is not an individual. It's not a group of people. It's the natural world. It's the environment. And what is lost is a habitat and a community. So, even in such a complicated case of a community trauma like 9/11, it was really easy to say, okay, it was the Al-Qaeda, unfortunately some people said, okay, it's Muslims. And it was really easy to go ahead and, go to war and mobilize and get behind that effort. But in this case, it's not so clear-cut. It's a very unique circumstance, and it's happening, in Indonesia and recently in Turkey with earthquakes a number of years ago. So it's, in terms of academic and intellectual exercise, it's a very new topic. So I'm excited to be here to kind of share what I've learned about it with you guys. So I work for the Children's Trauma Recovery Foundation, and we are a DMH-funded organization, and our mission is to train liaisons in the community so that those communities are better prepared to handle critical incidents like murders, suicides, community traumas, things like 9/11, or what happened in New Orleans. And that's basically how I came to be at Otis Air Force Base on September 7th. I got a call at like 10:30 at night on the 6th from my boss and said, we got the call from DMH. We got to be on call and be ready to go. And he's talking in all this military language. He's really into this. We're going to get triage the case. And I'm like, okay, Steve, I'll be ready. I'll be ready to go. And 2 hours later, he's like, all right, we're going to be on the Cape at 8 o'clock in the morning. I said, okay. So I'm thinking, so I got to get up around 4 in the morning. It's like 10:30, 1 o'clock now. So it ended up being a really long day because we got down to the base, and what had been established was, I don't know if it's hard for you to imagine, but basically an Air Force hangar. So we're talking about a room probably 4 times as long as this, twice or 3 times as wide, and probably a ceiling 3 times as high. A huge, enormous building filled with probably more human service workers than there were evacuees. There was every type of service you could imagine. The Salvation Army was there, United Way was there, giving food and clothing and water. The Massachusetts Registry of Motor Vehicles was there doing background checks and giving people IDs. There was more state police and army officials than you could imagine. The part that I was part of was this piece doing mental and physical health screens for people, which is a very, very important piece in my opinion, because a lot of people had come either without medication because it had been lost, or excuse me, or they didn't have medication and needed it and weren't able to get it in New Orleans. And also it was just a way for us to check in with folks just on how they're doing. Really briefly, and also a way for folks to know that they were cared for. And basically, I was doing some of that, but I was also kind of just sitting down and eating with people. A lot of free food, which was fantastic. And just checking in with people, seeing what they needed, helping them get through the different stations. And after they had done all these things, they were assigned to dorms, which were old Air Force barracks. And so we would kind of get everyone everything they needed, some clothes, some food, we'd get them their screens, and then we'd put them on the bus and ride with them over to the barracks. And that was basically a 14 or 15-hour day. It ended up being really long days down there because, an hour and a half commute, stay on the base for 8 to 12 hours, come back home, before you know it, you've been out of the house for 16 hours. So while we were at the base, the base was really established in a nice way. If you can imagine, over here we have the mess hall. Over here's the women and families dorm. Over here we have the dorm with pets, individuals who came with pets, and then kind of out on the outskirts there was the men's dorm. And in the middle there was a courtyard. So this was an area where people would come and sit, they might eat lunch, a lot of pickup basketball, we had a volleyball net set up. So it afforded individuals to come and make connections with one another, and kind of share their stories, and enabled us to sit down with people in a really casual way and interact with them and build some trust and begin to establish a relationship. So my main goals there, or my organization's main goals there, were to basically set up something for the kids and the families. The kids were enrolled in Bourne public schools, so they were going to school, and in the afternoon, a lot of the times they would come off the bus, and parents were running around. I mean, a lot of parents were there, but some parents had to be, looking at housing, trying to contact family members. So what we did was we set up a therapeutic after-school program, is what I'll call it, which really consisted of a play group, some tutoring, and an art group. And in the sense that it was therapeutic for this case, I would say is a lot of times when people are exposed to really stressful events, it impacts their bodies as much as it does their minds. A lot of adrenaline gets released, the autonomic nervous system is triggered into, like Kathy said, fight or flight, and it's sometimes really difficult to recalibrate and regulate and kind of reach a baseline in your body again. So what we were doing in this play group was just running around and having fun and trying to get kids back to a place where they could be kids again. Trying to get people back to baseline, and really just our number one goal was not to do any harm, not to really increase people's symptoms or stress levels, and just really have a nice time. We used a lot of expressive and play therapy techniques. We did a lot of music, singing, dancing. We did a lot of work with a parachute, and a lot of cooperative play with some fantasies where we position the children in really altruistic roles and empowered roles. So, we need you to, not connected necessarily to the hurricane, but maybe they're scientists and they're collecting, some gems that are going to, save the planet. Something, really far out. I'm a creative guy, and so I come up with these things on the spot. I'm a little stuck right now, but anyway, that being said, so what I noticed during these groups, which is really how I got to know the children, was that when it rained, it was really scary. I personally don't like the rain much, but when it rained, I noticed a difference in not only the children but families, and being attuned with someone when you're working with them, I noticed a change in myself and my colleagues. So this one particular time, we're playing in the rain. Well, we weren't intentionally playing in the rain. It was just kind of a cloudy day. We're sitting out on the parachute. We're doing some groups. I think we were sharing our news for the day. And it starts to drizzle a little bit. So I'm like, okay, great. We have no indoor space. What are we going to do here? So we all just go right up and under the parachute. I don't know are you guys familiar with these parachutes before? You know what I'm speaking about? So we just get under the parachute and we're all talking. And then it really starts to downpour. And I'm like, oh my goodness, we have no indoor space. I got like 25 minutes left in group. These kids are running around. They're really escalated, pretty dysregulated. I don't really know what to do. So we all huddle under this little overhang at this building. And I look at my colleague. I'm like, where are we at? And then all of a sudden the little girl says, oh, can we do the bubbles? I'm like, yes, let's do the bubbles. It's a great idea. So we break out, probably these 15 packs of these little wedding bubbles. And these kids are just having a blast, standing there blowing bubbles in this pouring, pouring rain. Totally safe, connected with their friends, with an adult there keeping them safe and calm, kind of regulating, because, of course you have kids blowing bubbles at each other, and, you get some hurt feelings in that way. But, and I realized afterward, at the time it was kind of like, all right, let's just go with the flow, let's just do what these kids need to do. And they needed to blow bubbles. And after I realized, what we did, we really helped these children have a safe, fun experience in nature that not necessarily offsets what they had gone through, but contributes to their understanding of rain and the natural world. And also, I don't know if it's something about wedding bubbles, but these bubbles were flying, and the wind was blowing, and you could see bubbles off in the distance, 100, 150 feet. And my roommate's a graphic designer, and he said to me, Jesse, do you realize what you're saying? There's these kids that have been, taken from their homes because of this devastating hurricane, and you're sitting out here blowing bubbles with them, and they're sustaining themselves for hundreds of feet in the rain. Bubbles in the rain, Jess. This is a beautiful image of resilience. So that was a really nice experience that we had in group together. So what would happen is then we'd finish group, we'd go have dinner together. Oftentimes I'd end up eating with families. Just sitting down, eating the cafeteria food, which wasn't all that bad. And I'm a vegan too, so I'm very picky. I don't eat very much at all. But when I do, I eat in large quantities. So we'd go have dinner together, and then we'd bring them to this tutoring program. We had some unbelievable, amazing volunteers from not only the Cape area, but also from our trauma response network in Boston, who came down, and children were able to have an adult sitting there with just them doing this tutoring. And no one ever trained these tutors. They're just naturally, great at what they do, because they were just heaping the praise and heaping the encouragement on these kids, and really had a knack for redirecting challenges and kind of struggles they had. Which is really important, I feel like, when working with kids who have been through really stressful stuff, where as Kathy said, there might be some sense of badness in the world, but also internally. In other work that I do in the city, with teachers, I've noticed how significant the emotion of shame can be for a lot of these kids. Kids exposed to really stressful stuff. And I don't think teachers necessarily mean to do it. In fact, I'm pretty sure teachers don't mean to do it. But I've seen a lot of kind of inadvertent shaming, which, some kids are tough and they can handle, but kids that have been through really stressful experiences where they might have these cognitions where they're not safe, they're not worthy, they're alone, they're not in control, this can be a really powerful thing to kids. So the tutors that we were working with had an amazing knack, just instinctual, I don't know what it was, but of really avoiding that and really working with kids and redirecting kind of struggles they had. So they'd go to tutoring, and then we'd do an art group, which was basically just like arts and crafts at a summer camp. We didn't do very much trauma processing. With the folks that we were working with, I felt like, and my supervisor and my colleagues kind of worked under the assumption that these people were still kind of in stabilization mode. It wasn't really time for processing at this point. They were living on an Air Force base, so it was just time to get connected, build some attachments, feel safe, and just be together and laugh and have fun, which is oftentimes the best medicine. Just being with people that you care about and laughing and having fun. And feeling safe. So then we take them from the art group and we'd go and drop them off back with their parents. And we always kind of give the parents a little check-in, they did this, and that, and we played games and they had fun and they did a good job. Which I've also heard this from teachers, that having that relationship and calling parents when their kid's having a great day can often be can build a strong foundation for when you got to call and say, your kid's not having the best day. So that was definitely a real key piece, being able to walk folks back to their rooms and meet with their parents. And in fact, there was this one girl who had a difficult time making it to the bathroom. And this is not an uncommon symptom of people who have been, children especially, who've been exposed to really stressful experiences, traumatic events. Given what I said about the dysregulation of the body and the nervous system, just simple things like going to the bathroom, sweating, drinking, eating, sleeping, these things can often be really impacted. So it's not a really uncommon symptom, but it turns out that after sharing that with her mother, she said, well, my daughter had heard a story about some of the things that were happening at the convention center in the bathrooms, and now she's scared to go to the bathrooms. I said, no, that makes perfect sense. This girl's taking care of herself. This girl is taking really good care of herself. She does not feel safe enough to go into the bathroom. So, very simply, just made an action plan. If you're ever at group and you need to go to the bathroom, just let one of us know, and we'll walk you right to the bathroom. We'll stand outside. We'll make sure no one's going to get you, and you'll be totally safe. And something like such a complicated problem can be that simple. That was really a learning experience for me. Just having that 2-minute conversation with the parents, it really helped me to realize how powerful that relationship can be with parents. So, and then just briefly, people. Then, after about 6 weeks of being on the base, people worked with transitional assistance advocates. I might just be making this up, but that sounds like what they did. Because what these folks did was they met with each family or each individual and said, what do you want? Where do you want to go? Do you want to stay here? Do you want to leave? If you want to stay here, where would you like to live? Let us show you some communities. Let us look at different apartments. So they really helped people figure out kind of what their goals were, and then help them to secure leases, find employment. And the Massachusetts government, state government, was kind enough to be able to give individuals up to 18 months free, is that right? 18 months free rent, up to, I'll say, because it was never guaranteed. And then our role, kind of since the base is closed, I've gotten to go to birthday parties. I've gotten to have some really funny phone conversations from kids, calling way past their bedtime. And we've done like a lot of housewarming visits. We worked with the company Life is Good, who are one of our corporate sponsors, and they had raised about $7,000 or $8,000 that they entrusted us to distribute to some of the families that we had worked with most closely. So we were able to give people a fairly nice chunk of money to kind of begin to make their house a home. And they also donated some great clothing, which is on its way. some hats, T-shirts, but also things like winter gloves, like wool socks, scarves, things that people not from this area aren't necessarily used to wearing. So we got that stuff, and we're thinking about having a little local springtime reunion for folks, because what was most amazing to me, I think, was how the survivors, how the people that came to this state bonded together. I don't think that it was necessarily, the mental health professionals or the human service workers that really played the largest role. I think, being so close and in such close quarters with people who had such a similar experience with you, and being able to know that you were in this place where you guys were kind of on the same plane in some ways. People that really did well on the base, I would say, were people that were able to enter into those relationships and forge some relationships. And it's my goal and our organization's goal to be able to help sustain those relationships a little bit longer by doing some events together. Additionally, I think people also did really well when they were able to be really proactive in the process of moving off the base. A lot of families had told me, coming from New Orleans, that they had... You have to understand, the people that came to Massachusetts were people that were still in New Orleans after it had been evacuated. So the people that came here were not at the Superdome for more than a little bit of time after they had left the city. They weren't anywhere else. They'd stayed in their homes. And a lot of people had stayed there by choice. So I had talked to people that had to literally be taken out at gunpoint from their homes, put on a helicopter, shipped to the Superdome for about an hour, get on a bus, get on a plane then, and not until they were in a plane for over an hour even know that they were coming to Massachusetts. So, I mean, we talk about empowered transitions for children in school, and empowered transitions are great for all of us personally. Being able to take some control in what you're doing and where you're going to go next. And this is definitely, I would not describe this as an empowered transition at all. Total loss of control. You're leaving, let's go. You're not going to know where you're going, and boom, you're there. So in terms of folks that seem to do well on the base, the folks that had those relationships with one another, but also people that were really active in the process of moving off the base, that took a really active role in and kind of took control and said, yeah, let's really look at this as a new start. Let's look at this as, yeah, this is a great place to live. The schools are good. The weather might not be great. It might not be as easy to find grits. And some of the stores might be different. But, that's what was my understanding, is that people did really well when they were able to kind of be very, very active in this process of moving. So that's pretty much the extent of my work there, and thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you very much, Jesse, for really giving us a sense of what we need to do first and how to respond to both trauma and the opportunity for growth as a first responder. I want to thank Dean McCartney and the Ed School for having this forum. I think it's a very important topic, one we'll be talking about for years to come, and one in which we need to draw on what we know as educators, what we know as scientists, and what we know as human beings to try to get through. And I also commend the community for the responses already. I don't think that there are any experts, and certainly I don't think of myself as an expert, but I do think it's very important that we talk to children about this, and that in talking to children, we recognize that we have to make sense of it for ourselves as well. We sort of divided up what we talk about, and I'm going to just focus on three issues. One is, what's the nature of this disaster? What have people gone through? Secondly, what are some ideas about how to frame conversations with children about this? And to do that, I'll draw on my experiences in working with families, talking about parental depression, which is often associated with trauma and often unspeakable. Also working with families after 9/11, during the Gulf War, and other things. And thirdly, I'll speak really as a citizen about the fact that I don't think we can go through an experience and see the disparities that were uncovered by it without seeking fundamental systems reform in education and in health. And so I'll try to do that in 10 to 15 minutes so that we'll have time for discussion, and I'll use a few notes but not all the time. Just to take the images, and I should also say that I'm particularly excited to be on this panel with my colleagues. I don't think of us as the Jacksons, but in a very different way, Kathy and Jesse and I are all working on a program with Head Start to try to develop an effective strategy for parents undergoing adversity, parents who've been depressed. And those parents, many of them, have been traumatized. And we have a wonderful federal grant that we're trying to develop a national model with, so we're all working together in a variety of ways. I would also say, and this is something that Jesse so beautifully illustrated, that it's not so hard to talk about risk. We know that people who have been traumatized before are likely to be traumatized again. We know that the more a life is dislocated, the more the disruption, the greater the likelihood of a long-term difficulty. But what's really important is, how do people overcome this well? What is the resilience that we can try to foster, and what is the resilience that we can learn from the extraordinary courage of people who have undergone this and come out on the other side? One of the elements that runs throughout all of the literature, and Jesse's work so beautifully illustrated, is the difference between being a passive victim and being able to take some actions. And I think that's a theme that I'll develop in different ways, but I think clearly was very important. And I think the second one is that if we were to talk about what either is preventive in the face of trauma or preventive in the face of the risk factors for depression, it's human relationships and human connectedness. Not just at the individual and family level, although those are crucial, but at the community, school, church, and other levels. And I think those are the ties that we need to be trying to reestablish. That's what the evidence would tell us. And on the other hand, those are the ties that are most at risk for the 1 million people who were dislocated by Katrina. Now, just to quickly put into words what Kathy was talking about, 1 million people displaced, a large number of homes destroyed, and then not only the event itself, but the multiple events of evacuation. So not only the loss of a place to live in the short run, but a very difficult passage, whether it was to the Astrodome in Houston, whether it was through the convention center, or whether it was staying in one's own home and eventually leaving. So as we think about how we might try to help, the most important thing as we think about individuals is, what have they actually gone through? What was the nature of the passage? And what can we do to try to muster our resources there? I think a second very important point, I've been doing a lot of work with the Carter Center in Atlanta, and we had a discussion about this at one of our recent meetings. And just one very simple fact: there are 100,000 people from New Orleans who have fled to Atlanta. You don't think of Atlanta as a major hub for evacuees. You think about Houston, or you think about Memphis, or maybe Baton Rouge. But the fact that there are 100,000 people in Atlanta, 38,000 families registered, speaks to the fact that for many evacuees, they're going to areas where there are a very large number of people and not a lot of experience in this massive a dislocation. And so I think that's a very important factor to keep in mind, the magnitude of the scale. And I happen to know Atlanta. It happens to be a relatively well-governed southern city, but it's not equipped to handle 100,000 evacuees, and that's an important issue that we need to think about. And then I think it's very important to think about cultural issues. I was struck by this. I was at a meeting of the National Mental Health Association, and the head of that association in Louisiana is an African-American woman from Baton Rouge. And she was making the point that in Baton Rouge, most of the folks are Protestant and evangelical. Most of the people who came from New Orleans were Catholics. And as she said, we don't even celebrate Mardi Gras. Well, this is within the same race, same organization, the National Mental Health Association, and that she was speaking of the fact that culture does not get transposed. Culture existed in New Orleans in that milieu, and as these people have dislocated, they're going to regions that are very different. We hope that Massachusetts is responsive, but we need to be very aware of those issues as time unfolds. And then finally, I think it's important to remember what's going on in New Orleans now. This is a continuing tragedy. Kathy said maybe half the people won't be able to return there. This is from George Vignette in an editorial in the New York Times. He's living in New Orleans. Why are we so angry? On my way every day to where we used to live, I drive through a city I love that lies in ruins. The park that lines one side of a boulevard I follow home is now a solid wall of debris 20 feet high. On the other side of the street, desolate houses destroyed by flood, gate back with shattered windows, open doors, ragged holes in rooftops, kicked out by families trapped in their attics when the water rose. Every single thing. Wrecked houses, abandoned cars, even people. Everything is covered in a pall of gray dust, as if all the color of this once vibrant city has been bleached. It's important to remember that the situation in New Orleans is a continuing tragedy, and the trauma for those who left and those who stayed is ongoing. And George's editorial was about the need to rebuild the levees to be able to withstand a Force 5 hurricane. That's one of the issues that's being hotly debated. But when we think about trauma, we need to think about how to prevent trauma in the future, and certainly making New Orleans safe physically is an important part of that, although no simple task. And so to move then quickly to what we know, we also had a discussion about this at the Institute of Medicine, and I think another very important fact about dislocation, immigration, and trauma is that all the evidence says that if you can keep the natural units together, one should. So there's a lot of work about immigration which show that if people live in a certain region and they move together to another region, they do much better than if they're dispersed widely. Obviously, in planning, we need to think about how to reassemble those units and put them back together that are going to most enable people to prosper and rebuild their lives. Religious units, that is churches, community units, school units, and neighborhood units. And I think how we think about bringing people together is a crucially important one, but I think it is one of the things that would help deal with the trauma in a preventive way. Also, to take from what Jesse has said, we think about dealing with trauma as first, in a way, giving psychological and physical first aid, finding people safe places to live, helping them understand that every effort will be made to keep things safe, and then over time being able to address what they've gone through and make sense of it. And this is an intermediate phase, certainly relative to New Orleans, that will last 2 months to 10 months to 12 months as people try to figure things out and finally make a long-term decision about where to end up. The more we can give people choice about that, the more they can choose, the better from all the evidence we have. And then to shift gears for a moment, what about being a teacher in a classroom, either here at the Ed School or in many of the schools that our graduates and people in these of this program work in? And if you were to ask me, do I think this is an important issue to talk about in classrooms? Absolutely. I absolutely do. Why? Because just like after 9/11, all the media were completely saturated with images of New Orleans for a week and now continually for months afterwards. I think it's highly unlikely that children were not exposed to this and did not have questions about it. Therefore, I think we have a responsibility to try to speak to them about it. And rather sadly for me, I've had a lot of experience in trying to talk about difficult things with families. I wish there weren't so many difficult things that families had to deal with. But we started a program in the 70s talking to families about how they could talk to their kids about the threat of nuclear war. We've used that, as I mentioned, in the Gulf War. It provided a model for how we worked with families to talk about depression. what are the elements? One key element is that if I'm going to talk to someone about a difficult event, I need to make sense of it first for myself. I think that's both an individual matter, but in schools, I think it's useful for teachers and administrators to talk to one another and to have a coordinated approach, to choose a time and a place that's safe, announce it, and say that kids will be able to talk about it. Certainly with older kids in a civics class, with younger kids in a community sharing. But to say this is a difficult matter to talk about, we're going to talk about it, and we're going to try to plan to make it safe. I think a second thing that's very important is that one tries to balance sort of general information. In talking about depression, we talked about that it's a biological illness, that there are things that people can do to overcome it. We talked about treatments and we talked about preventions. And then we tried to pair that with what the family had gone through uniquely with depression, what their view of depression was. The same thing in working with military families. And I think here, children of different ages, they're going to have different experiences. Some of them in Massachusetts will know families who got displaced, some won't. Some will have parents who've gone to New Orleans to help, some won't. Some may have lost people in New Orleans. Some may actually have classmates who've come from New Orleans. Knowing what the composition of the class, what the experience has been, is crucially important because you want to pair the kinds of explanations to the level and kinds of questions that children have. And you want to pair a general discussion about what happened and that it's safe to discuss with trying to be as specific as possible with children's questions and to answer children's needs. Obviously, those families that have suffered bereavement, those families that have suffered catastrophic loss deserve our greatest concern. But I do think that many, many children are puzzled about this, and many children, just as after 9/11, are going to have questions about whether when it rains is it safe, or what's going to happen. And I think we have a real responsibility to respond to them. And I also think that there's a responsibility to recognize that this is a continuing conversation. In all of the work we've done, we've said we can't possibly expect one conversation to do it, and then my wife and I have been on this wonderful and complex journey trying to raise our 4 children. And all I can say is after that experience, I'm even more convinced that one conversation is not the answer, but opening a process by which this can be talked about over time. And I think that's the process that we as educators want to achieve, want to try to understand with our kids. And the 2 things that one can say to establish that process are, what are your questions? I may not be able to answer them, but I want to hear them. And we will talk more than once. I will bring us back to this and we'll talk about it. And that also opens the possibility of a dialogue over time. And finally, I think probably, and this is something, again, that Jesse illustrated, I think it's very important to provide children with a message of hope and that there are things that can be done. After 9/11, the stories of the heroism of the policemen, the firemen, and the public health workers, and then of children trying to help these rescuers, were really powerful. I think there is much that we can do in terms of our response as a caring country, taking care of individuals, taking care of families, making sure that this kind of thing not happen again, but above all, that we really can do things now and in the future, and that children can learn from that. And so finding stories of the positive, finding ways that people have made it through, is an essential part of the message that we need to get through to kids. And finally, I recognize that this is a forum for educators, but I want to direct my last remarks to the healthcare system. And I do that because I'm someone who works primarily in healthcare, although I could make exactly the same arguments if I were a school teacher about what I think we need to do for the schools. But the issue is this, and I can speak as a citizen and as a person, and the events in New Orleans, I think, were absolutely horrifying because they revealed the extent of the disparities that we have not addressed as a country, the disparities between rich and poor, and to a large extent the disparities between black and white. I had actually been in the South registering voters in Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia many times in the 60s. I'd grown up in Atlanta. And I remember that the first time I worked in the Delta, a lot of the Delta flooded. It flooded every summer. And you might have a romantic notion, you know, in the movement we were trying to change that society. You think about a flood coming through, washing things away and giving people a fresh start. But of course exactly the opposite happened. In a flood, those who had the least lost the most. And those were in the Mississippi Delta, the sharecroppers, very poor people. And I think exactly the same thing is at a huge risk in New Orleans. That in fact, those who had the least will lose the most unless we address these disparities. Now, as a healthcare provider, I can say two things, and Jesse alluded to this. There are many, many stories, and I talked to people who ran the evacuation at Dobbins Air Force Base, which is in Atlanta, of people who are dependent on medicines to survive, heart medicines, medicines for blood pressure, medicines for mental illness, that completely lost their medicines and didn't have any records of what they were on, any kind of care. We need to have a way to take care of people that isn't dependent on whether they can remember their medicines or not. We need a national health care system that will take care of people all along the way. And I think that as I thought about the movement, I was struck by a second parallel, that in the movement there was a fairly simple principle, or Occam's razor, that was used, and that is those actions were valuable which enabled people to become masters of their own fate and to become independent. And in registering voters, the idea was that registering to vote was one of the ways to gain empowerment and eventually bring about a just society. But the question was always, is this action really going to help individuals be truly independent? And I think that, in a very simple first principles way, is the principle we should use in New Orleans and in the rebuilding efforts, which is, are we directing our resources to enabling people to be independent? Are we directing our resources to enabling people to be masters of their own fate? And I know that Kathy will agree with me that in turn all of the work with trauma suggests that the more people can have control and master things, the more likely they are to be able to deal with trauma. Now, again, I think the magnitude of the disparities that were evident in healthcare, evident in education, evident in poverty, cannot be addressed except by fundamental structural reform. I think we need to have national health insurance. I think we need a larger investment in an equitable education for all. And I look forward to your questions and a dialogue with you. Thank you.
I'm going to sum this up, and then we're going to show you about 3 minutes of video so that you can actually see some of the children talking about what happened to them. And really we want to put some faces and some situations in front of you, and then we really would like to take questions. What I'd like to do is really try to pull these thoughts together just by reiterating a couple of important issues. The first is that as educators, as counselors, we have great power, particularly those of us who see children every day, those of you who have these children in your classrooms. It's critical that you help them, assist them, support them in the ways that both Jesse described to you and that Bill described to you, in really supporting them in dealing with difficult issues, particularly this issue which is really on our minds nationally at this time. I think in doing that, however, one of the other things you really need to think about is that as individuals who work with children and families who are in distress, we need to really follow the first premise that Bill presented to us, and that is we really need to be aware and in touch with the impact of these kinds of distressing, difficult situations on ourselves. So we first need to know ourselves. And I'd leave you with the message that in spite of the great and powerful intellectual composition of this university, you can't deal with trauma just with your intellect. You can use it, and you can really use it to master and to really use traumatic experiences for learning, but you also need to feel. And you will feel. But you also need to be able to know how much you can feel and when you need to step back and take care of yourself. Because the issue is really mastery and resilience. If there are any messages from the trauma literature, those are the two. And not just in the short run, but for the long run. So the ultimate message almost becomes, in order to take care of others, we also need to take care and know ourselves. And this tends to be a critical message, because otherwise we'll be sitting here a year from now and really not want or not be able to really continue to think about the ongoing trauma that 1 million people have really experienced in our country. And we need to have the strength and fortitude and endurance to be able to think about those issues into the future. Now, a couple of quick things I want you to think about as you watch this film. Again, I think Bill has done a fantastic job talking to us about how to work with children around difficult issues. If you could think about those things, but I'd like for you to notice not only how explicit children are and how incredible they are in their ability to let you know about their experience, but also how they very naturally move toward a message of hope. And it's that critical message of hope that the resilience literature tells us is really the center of being able to maintain resilience and to move forward. It really is that vision of a positive future in the context of even a very negative present. So I'd ask you to think about that as you see this film. And as I'm getting it ready, I don't know, Jesse, if you and Bill may have any final comments as well.
For teachers, I mean, one thing I've been taught as a clinician is that you can't really take care of anyone unless you're taking care of yourself, which really piggybacks on what Kathy said and a little bit what Bill said, that self-care is often one of the most important things you can do as a helper. And also, I mean, I think just doing things that enable you to build relationships with children pre-trauma, because oftentimes having that infrastructure in place, being able to kind of communicate and connect and be attuned with a child can be, what actually gives them the resources to reach out and connect with you afterward. And then, I mean, teachers have to teach, and it's really going to be hard for anybody to do two things at once, especially if it's kind of trying to get someone to pass MCAS and also trying to get someone to, have a healthy emotional and social world. So, I mean, working with counselors and having a collaborative relationship with the infrastructure, the mental health counselors in the school, I mean, I think that's really something that doesn't happen as often as it would be nice if it did. So let's watch this video, Kathy. Unless you want to say
no, I'm all set.
This is essentially the Katrina's Kids Project, and I'm going to show you, I'm going to talk loudly and show you a little bit of film. I'd like for you to really understand both what we're, if I can get this to move, which is not doing, maybe we won't watch this. Well, I may have this frozen. We may have to tell you about this. Isn't this always the way with guess I don't have any help, do I? We may just do questions instead. Yeah, it looks like it's frozen. I think we can try that. Let me at least tell you about this project, and I can send you back to the website if you can't watch this now. But this is a project that was developed quite spontaneously by some neighborhood women in Houston when the children and their families arrived around the beginning of September. And essentially, they decided that the children in Houston who had come from Louisiana really needed something to do. And they rented a huge, it looked like a hangar or a big warehouse, and they had a lot of tables and they had a lot of art supplies. So they sat down with the children and actually took out the art supplies and asked them to draw, and told them that they could talk about the events that they just experienced in whatever way they really felt, there we go, was helpful to them. And they did attract some attention, interestingly enough. And a couple of networks really became interested, and hopefully we'll get some sound here, and maybe you'll see some of this.
An army of counselors and therapists have been sent to shelters and schools, and in Houston, where so many ended up, a special project is underway. ABC's Barbara Pinto is there.
All right.
Behind the rows of cots in the corner of the Reliance Center, something remarkable is happening.
This my brother, this my mother, this and a one-night retreat.
Art has long been used to help the youngest victims of war and trauma. They can leave their painful memories on paper and move on.
They're having just a release, emotional release.
This art project started weeks ago when thousands of families moved in.
Their parents were so busy trying to look after the family and getting lines for this and that.
So these women from the neighborhood showed up with crayons and paper. They're not psychologists, just moms.
The pens and markers and crayons have said what in many cases the children cannot.
I'm not scared of talking to women out there. I draw this picture because it's like showing everything that happened.
13-year-old Elisa Thomas spent 5 days at the Superdome.
It was horrible. The people were saying, we need food and water. Please let us go.
This picture, she says, is her story. The way she felt then, the way she feels now.
The water kept rising up to people's houses.
14-year-old Reginald Atkins started drawing and couldn't stop.
So I can show everyone who I am.
That is an important message here.
We're not refugees, but we don't have a home. We're survivors.
What is striking is the optimism of children. Next to the Superdome, above all the suffering, the sun is shining.
There's always going to be a bad side, but on the other side of the river, it's always going to be hope.
When Elisa Thomas draws her story, that is how it ends. Barbara Pinto, ABC News, Houston.
And you can see more of the children's drawings at abcnews.com.
Again, we wanted you to have a sense of some of the real children and what they were able to do and how they were able to talk about and tell us about the events that were in their lives and how they also very much talked about hope. So, what I think we'd like to do now, we have about 10 minutes left, and I would really like to take your questions. You've been very patient and quiet sitting here listening to us. So, we had some questions that we really asked ourselves as we were putting this together, and we wanted to share those with you and also see what kind of questions you had for any of us. So I'd like to open this up to the group. Questions of any of us?
Would you like
Joy.
to use the microphones, or is it fine if we talk from here?
Can you all hear Joy, or I can actually go?
I was wondering what your thoughts were. I had seen a program recently this weekend, actually, that 250,000 pets were left behind in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, and of those, about 15,000 were recovered, and of that, a smaller amount had been actually reunited with their families. And Jesse, I was thinking about specifically when you said some people were removed at gunpoint from their homes. I know the same thing somewhat happened with pets, that people were forcibly removed from their homes without that. And I wonder if there's any specific considerations you have to give, because for many people that was part of their family, and for some their only family member in a way. I know many older adults and single adults felt like they lost their entire family within this. And I know there's been policy discussions about whether they should change that for the future when they evacuate, because in many ways it was a secondary form of trauma for those people. And so I just wondered if you could speak to that at all, about how that affected people any differently than the trauma they experienced from the hurricane, and what you think about a policy change.
Well, I mean, Massachusetts was really unique in that there was pets brought here. So there was one woman brought her little dogs. There was a huge German retriever running around the German Shepherd, running around the base. But there was one guy who was definitely having a hard time with it. He would have nightmares, kind of about where his dog was, because the relationships that people form with animals, especially dogs, can be really powerful. But he would have nightmares. He had a hard time sleeping. He didn't want to sleep. And so I just checked in with him and talked to him about it. There was actually a website set up for people to find their pets, though, I mean, like you said, it was not very effective. But in terms of policy change, I don't really know what the existing policy is, because in Massachusetts, like I said, people were allowed to bring pets here. But I think you're right in that it is really significant, and in terms of people's health and mental health, and a lot of times that's a big part of people's social world. So to be able to allow that to happen, I think makes a lot of sense.
I think it's also important, as we think about disparities, that lots and lots of pets were evacuated. The people who drove out in their own cars voluntarily before the hurricane struck took their pets with them. And that from the point of view of strategic planning for the future, we need to plan to be able to evacuate and allow people to take what's most important to them. I think that pets are in fact part of the family, and that's it's a very important issue. And I think that kids and parents who've lost pets will have a much harder time than those who didn't.
Yes.
So my question is for any of the panelists, actually. Dr. Beardsley's last point was that Katrina highlighted the disparity in the country. So I'm thinking long term. So what happens to the kid who is not as resilient in school, who gets then labeled or relegated to lower track classes as a result of this trauma event? How do we keep the attention ongoing? And what's the threshold for when we need to think about how to teach or educate children differently because of the trauma they experienced? I worry that these kids will end up back in that cycle. And so the disparity is highlighted, but years down the road, it kind of continues on. So how do we deal with that?
I think you highlight a very important problem, which is how labels can compound problems, and how to use a model of additive risk, if someone is already at some risk and then suffers a trauma, then their risk goes up considerably. It snowballs. I think there are two issues, both of which you highlight. The answers to these questions are long-term answers with long-term supports for kids. We should be thinking about programs that are in place 1, 2, and 5 years down the line, and not so much programs for psychological healing from trauma, although those are important, but really the whole range of supports that people need, including good education, including stable neighborhoods and communities. I think the second point is an equally valid one, and that is that under the experience of trauma, many youngsters may develop school learning problems phobias about going to school, fear about taking risks because of being different and being shamed, fear about actually taking the risks of solving a problem and speaking up. And I think, therefore, we need to be aware that the possibility of a traumatic reaction is leading to a learning problem and really trying to address that. Kathy, you may want to comment on that because you've had a lot of experience as well. Or Jesse.
I think one of the first things is that educators need to understand the nature of traumatic experience and be able to really both differentiate it from other issues that children may be having, and then there needs to be a vehicle for response. And I agree completely with Dr. Beardsley that it needs to be a long-term response rather than an immediate short-term response. I'm concerned, as he is and as you are, that here are children who are coming from a different geographical part of the country, who, speak English differently than those of us in New England, who eat different food. They love grits. And how are we going to help these families find grits in their supermarkets? You can get down to issues around daily life. They've never worn gloves or boots and probably haven't seen snow. And so all of these changes are things that our educational system, more than probably any other system, needs to recognize, because these children are spending more time with their teachers than probably any other professionals outside, of their family. And so it's really critical. So my first request would be, let's get into not just the educational systems in New Orleans or Louisiana or Atlanta or Houston, but let's do something larger than that to really empower teachers to be able to support children. And then, of course, if we had a national health insurance system that also recognized mental health issues and we took that to mental health and educational issues, then we might have some funding stream, particularly for support and intervention.
I'll just talk loud. I'm wondering if there has been any effort to put together literature to give to so many of these schools that have been have gotten an influx of students from New Orleans and other states, and how to deal with them in terms of their cultural differences and things like that. I taught in New Orleans before I came here, and I've gotten calls from a lot of my kids who are getting not a really good reception in these places, a lot to do with cultural differences. So I didn't know if there was any organizations or work being done to help educate new or school communities that are receiving kids from the New Orleans area.
I know of a couple of resources. I certainly don't know that they have reached the level of being available nationally, but Civitas has a wonderful book for teachers about traumatized children, and they have actually been sending it free of charge to a number of schools around the country where there are concentrations of these children. Unfortunately, it's primarily oriented to children who experience family violence and trauma, and so they're now even talking about rewriting this wonderful manual that describes traumatic events in the first half, and then you turn it over and it actually has activities and interventions that you can be involved in the classroom. They're also talking about translating it into Spanish, which probably is now going to go on the back burner. They're probably going to rewrite it to have it relate to national disasters. The other piece that I know about are several educational pieces that were developed after 9/11. And actually, the Child Development Unit at Children's Hospital has a nice series of handouts, and I'd be glad to give them to any of you who are interested. And I know that they've been handing those out to anyone who's asked, that really lays out developmentally how children talk about traumatic events based on 9/11.
How do you cope with the anger that is now coming out? I'm from New Orleans. that is coming out of parents and the children for this disruption of their lives when they see everything is fine every place else.
I mean, I think that we need to honor the anger. That is, there's a reason that people are angry. And it's about exactly what you say, the contrast between the way other people are living and the way people were displaced in New Orleans. I think that, again, when I talk about long-term change, long-term prevention, long-term addressing of disparities, I think that's the real solution. That people have a right to be angry. Although I don't think that anger is the most productive emotion to get through this. I think being angry is a phase, and then one moves beyond it. But the real question is, what are people angry about? How much of that reflects a fundamental disparity or a fundamental unfairness that we need to address? And I think that there were two things going on in New Orleans. One was this unimaginably powerful storm that then also destroyed the levee. Okay, if it hadn't destroyed the levee, the whole outcomes would have been quite different. And the second was that the burdens fell disproportionately on those who had the least resources. The people who were mobile and had access to the media and so on evacuated themselves. And so there was a disparity, for the most part, so that there was a disparity in the access to the resources. And I think those are things we need to address in our country so they don't happen that way again.
Do we have one last question?
Well, I just there's one fundamental structural inequality in America, and that's the inequality in health care. See, in education, we have the principle that everyone has a right to an education, however well we realize that. I think that there are two issues. Health outcomes in a country don't depend on the amount of money the country has. They depend on the disparity between rich and poor. Countries that have less of a disparity have far better outcomes. Secondly, all of the experiences, Europe, Japan, other places, with national coverage suggest that it's far more economical and effective in the long run. So, yes, there are a lot of people working. In fact, there are bills in the Massachusetts legislature that I think one or another will pass, which will have universal coverage in Massachusetts. I picked it partly because since I'm a doctor, I'm aware of those issues, but also because I think that as we go forward, many, many different people are going to be traumatized in different ways by the experiences in New Orleans. We can't know who they are now. And therefore, we need a net of coverage for all. To take the absurdity one step further, there are now bills in Congress to cut Medicaid and food stamps to poor children elsewhere in the country in order to pay for Katrina. That will only make those children who are cut at higher risk for other kinds of trauma. But we need to recognize that this is not going to be an effective social policy. It's not an argument about Democrats and Republicans. That's a different political argument. This is an argument about fundamental structure.
Thank you all very, very much for being here, and we will be here for a few minutes if people have individual questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Great. Thank you.